to welcome everyone to Kellogg College. Thank you very much for coming along to this, our first seminar of Trinity Term. It's the GCHU Public Seminar Series. We run these seminars twice a term, in week 1 and week 8. And we organise them on a range of themes that GCHU are interested in. So GCHU, the Global Centre on Healthcare and Urbanisation, is a research centre that brings together Kellogg College's interests in, on the one hand, sustainable urban development, and on the other, health and wellbeing, in particular evidence-based healthcare and medicine. And we organise these seminars twice a term. Today we have Dr. Catherine Maxwell organising and chairing the seminar. Catherine Maxwell is a research associate at GCHU, and she's also connected to the Sustainable Urban Development Programme at Continuing Education, as she was the first graduate of the DPhil programme in Sustainable Urban Development some years ago. She's now Technical Director of SWEPO, which is Swedish consultants, specialising in areas around climate change and particularly net zero. And so she's put together the programme this afternoon and will be introducing the 4 speakers. So thank you again to the speakers as well for coming along, and really looking forward to the presentations and the discussion. Thanks very much, Catherine.
Hi everybody, and thank you for joining us today for the seminar, which is around systems change and how cities can accelerate towards net zero. Now, I'm just going to provide a very brief overview before I introduce you to our speakers today. So we all know that the impact of climate change is very keenly felt within cities. And as a result of this, local governments are developing a variety of climate actions, both in terms of mitigation, so decarbonisation, and also adaptation in terms of resilience. And often these actions are detailed alongside their climate commitments in their climate action plans. So this seminar builds on that notion and says, okay, cities have climate actions, that's great, but how are they implementing them? And how do we accelerate and scale the current climate actions within cities? Specifically, what do we need to change within our current systems to reach our climate targets? So today we're going to discuss and debate these critical systems that underpin cities' approaches to climate change, specifically climate governance. So we're going to look at how we can rethink vertical governance in terms of working with national governments, international bodies, but also horizontally how local government can work with a variety of stakeholders and, importantly, citizen groups. We're going to also look at climate finance systems. So how do we rewire our economy and enhance access to and allocation of resources to local governments so we can deliver some of these actions on the ground. We're also going to look at whole systems innovation, which is a shift away from the traditional innovative approach, which is to look at just technology to solve a problem. And it's a bird's-eye kind of perspective, looking at kind of whole-scale innovation to deliver transformative action on the ground. And last but not least, we're also going to look at data systems, how we capture and analyse data, climate data specifically, to inform progress towards net zero targets. So the structure today is we've got 4 experts who are each going to pitch on why these systems are critical for net zero. And then there'll be an opportunity to ask questions as well. Following that will be a drinks reception where you can network and debate and discuss further. But without much further ado, I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker today, Dr. Andy Kerr. He is the Chief Strategy Officer of Climate KIC, which is the EU's climate innovation initiative, working with cities and organisations on their net zero plans and ensuring we progress towards a very resilient society. So Andy Kerr is going to talk about systems level innovation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine, and a very good evening to everyone here. So, as Catherine said, cities in the UK, cities across Europe, cities around the world have stepped up to the climate challenge and set these wonderfully ambitious targets, net zero by 2030, net zero by 2035, and so on. And once they've gone through the process, set the targets, then the question is how? How are we going to deliver those targets? And as soon as you start looking at the how, city authorities immediately start understanding that actually they don't have all of the tools. They don't have all of the know-how, they don't have all of the skill sets, the capabilities. And unfortunately, those highly paid consultants that they've just commissioned, they don't have them either. They don't have all of the answers. And even the great brains in an institution like this don't have all of the answers. So immediately you have a situation where we're dealing with cities which are complex systems, complex adaptive systems, where people do not have all of the answers about how you make rapid change at speed, at scale, to deliver a particular outcome. And that's the position that we've been working with a lot of cities across Europe, so over 100 cities across Europe as part of the sort of European cities mission, including in the UK, so Bristol and Glasgow. And these are the situations that these cities find themselves in. They suddenly find that they don't have access to the data they need because the energy company holds some, the water holds another, national bodies hold other bits. They don't have access to some of the key capabilities that they need or that the local businesses need to supply the services. For example, if we're doing a massive retrofit program. They don't have the ability to deal with communities who are objecting strongly to change being forced through on them. Yeah? So all of these issues are the sorts of things that all of the cities across Europe and elsewhere are facing. And that's where innovation comes in. And so I was asked to speak for 5 minutes on why is innovation critical. And for me, this gap between what we know we can achieve in the next 5, 10, 15 years and actually where we need to be, that's the innovation gap that we have. And this is not, as Catherine alluded to, this is not innovation as in the sort of Silicon Valley model of innovation, which is about finding the perfect technology and making some venture capitalists very rich by scaling it around the world. This is innovation as learning. This is understanding that actually we need to be innovating across a whole suite of the opportunities that exist within a particular place. Yeah. So this is very much about innovation in terms of building insights, innovation, intelligence to support further decisions. It's about building what we think of as portfolios, so essentially multiple connected innovations from which learning comes. So you're testing maybe a new technology, it may be trying something with a local community, it may be building a new market for something, it may be about governance and multi-level governance that's a real challenge for many cities. And this is large-scale learning by doing. And it's about building the capabilities within city authorities, within agencies, within communities, which accepts that we do not have all of the answers to get where we want to be. There is no roadmap that will get us from where we are for many of the cities to net zero in 2030. It doesn't exist. So we have to do it on a large scale learning by doing approach, which builds intelligence and insights to help people learn. And the sorts of things that we are doing and seeing innovation happening on policy and governance and regulatory frameworks, multi-level governance, who makes the choice? Is it the local community? Is it the city? Is it the national body? Behaviours, social behaviours. If we have people who are scared and frightened about the future, they cling on to what they have. They do not change. How do we create the space to allow them to change? How do we build the storytelling and the narratives to give space to change? Yes, technology is important, but that's not actually the key determinant at the moment. There is lots of money out there. Very little of it is being allocated in the way it needs to be allocated, blending public and private money to de-risk this. So this is innovation as some people have described as de-risking the future. Another way is of creating the enabling conditions that allows change to happen. And that is the crucial point about why innovation is important. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ashley. And next up we have Caroline Green, who's the Chief Executive of Oxford City Council. Caroline has a wealth of experience in senior leadership and local governance, has been with the council since 2016, and prior to that was leading on housing, planning and environmental work for the Local Government Association. So Caroline's kindly joined us today to talk about climate governance systems.
Thank you, Catherine. There we go. Actually, I think I'm going to pick up on some of the themes that Andy was addressing there, but I'm not speaking to you as a climate change expert, merely as somebody who's working within the system in Oxford and Oxfordshire on this challenge around governance. And I think, as you said, climate change and tackling the climate crisis is an increasing priority for businesses for citizens and for governments across the country, and you can pay consultants lots of money to advise you at each of those capacities. But for me, you know, there is no shortage of things happening. I agree we need more innovation, we need to create the space for the innovation. But the challenge for climate governance is how do we organise ourselves to facilitate that innovation, that change, but within a strategic and integrated approach, which actually leads to sustain systemic and transformational change. And to do that in a way that is socially equitable, hopefully in complement to, but at very least in balance with other competing demands on our society. So as a City Council working with other councils in Oxfordshire, we're on a journey, on a governance journey for this. So I'm not saying we've got all the answers, we are evolving as we go. The first point I want to make is that we do need that governance to align at all levels. We need leadership, policy, regulation and targets set by national government, along with a consistent approach to funding. But we also need to be working at that regional and sub-regional level on the things which, you know, impact on the city, but which actually have cross-boundary impacts. And, you know, planning for infrastructure, for transport, for grid capacity, it's the sub-regional level often that business cases are made for that. And of course there is an important role at city level for driving that action, and I think cities have a sense of identity, a place and a scale at which you can really test out some of that innovation. And then of course there's the community engagement and empowerment challenge. As Andy said, city councils, county councils, local authorities don't have either the power, the resources or the expertise to do this on their own. And when we talk about governance in this space, it is not about top-down instruction or enforcement. We need to find the governance. The governance is really about being a convener in this space, bringing key actors from across all of the sectors with their expertise to collaborate and co-design those solutions. But our key role is creating the framework for them to do that, convening partners to co-design, and really make the most of, in Oxford, the huge wealth that we've got in terms of data, analysis and innovation. So, our approach in Oxford to this challenge is not one that's been built overnight, and it is something which requires the maturity of relationships to develop. But our approach to accelerating progress around governance in the city has been developing for a number of years. We were the first place in 2019 to hold a citizens' assembly on climate change. That was 50 representatives from across the city, randomly selected, presented with evidence, of speakers, a number of partners, designed with partners across the city. And from that we took some important lessons and findings and steers, and from there we developed what we call the Zero Carbon Oxford Partnership, which brings together the 21 largest employers and largest producers of carbon emissions in the city to help us with this challenge. And our roadmap, which apparently doesn't exist, I'd actually agree with you, is aiming for a target of doing this by 2040. Perhaps not as ambitious as some, but it's actually based on that evidence and feedback that we got from our Citizens' Assembly. So where we are now with that, we developed our roadmap, but importantly an accompanying action plan. And I think it's the point that I want to make is that we need to find the framework which provides clear milestones and goals, which is articulated across different sectors in our roadmap, but recognising the point that we need to leave that space for innovation, adaptation along the way. And one of our challenges is how do we take that innovation and really scale it up. So, as well as our Citizens' Assembly and Zero Carbon Oxford Partnership, we've been working in partnership in other ways. We, along with the other councils in Oxfordshire, have signed up to a county-wide campaign to engage with consumers, lots of tools and advice and bringing people together around that. We're also really keen on working and exploring public-private partnerships and how we can bring investment to that. We held the first EV summit in Oxford in partnership with the County Council, the universities and Green TV. And out of that, connections made there led to the Europe's largest or most powerful EV charging centre, which you can now see at Redbridge Park and Ride. So that value not only of innovation, but actually connecting people is really important. I think the one where we've got a good history in Oxford and Oxfordshire of working at community level and driving innovation at community level, largely because we've got third sector dedicated resources and expertise in the form of the Low Carbon Hub and the range of projects that they bring through. And the important message there is not that the City Council or the County Council need to be in the lead on this project. Often we need to just get behind others. Our role, I think, then comes in how do we help take those innovations and have the right conversations with government about investment and scaling up. The one I was actually talking to Catherine about this earlier today, where I think we really need to focus next, is how do we really engage and build networks with our communities across the city. Our experience of trying to roll out housing decarbonisation, for example, has been that we've really struggled to get engagement and take up. So just as an example, one of the things we're now working on in Rose Hill in the city is engaging with residents and again with private sector providers on a pilot as to how we can roll out a sort of street-wide programme of retrofit. So the last thing I wanted to say was our own internal governance is also really important to this. We as authority have a really clear carbon management plan which we've been working to for a number of years, but it isn't led by a sustainable or climate change department within the City Council. It touches on all of our services and all of the interactions that these services have across the city are part of this wider governance picture.
Thank you very much for that insight, Caroline. And next up we have Dr. Girish Murali, who's the Head of Transition Finance Research at the University of Oxford and also visiting scholar at Imperial College London and St Paul Management University. So Dr. Murali is going to speak today around climate finance systems.
Hi, it's nice to be here, and I'll just start with the local and personal perspective connecting to what you just said. Just by being here in Oxford, we just moved here in October, I'm already greener. Right, being in Oxford, because we moved from the US, right, and we don't have cars, we just walk everywhere, bike everywhere, so, cities can do a lot to make that happen, but individuals can contribute too. So I just want to start there because it's been great. Not having a car, amazing. So now I'll move from the local and personal perspective to more of a global perspective. Some of this you may have seen before, but essentially cities account for about 70% of the global CO2 emissions. So it's significant, it's about 3/4. And it's also well known that these emissions, which are kind of contributing to global warming, can be reduced by 90% by 2050 by using commonly available measures like solar panels and electric vehicles and just greening the buildings and just changing habits. So that's the kind of the good news, and this means that we need a lot of money to do that, right? Just in emerging markets, which is the developing markets, developing countries, we need about $2.5 trillion a year. That's huge, and if you look at the money that we need in the developed world, it kind of maybe doubles. And now, so that's the amount of money we need, right? And how much is currently flowing? And these are slightly older numbers, but it gives you perspective. The amount of money that's flowing towards the green climate finance is about $384 billion per year, right? So in some sense, it's 1/10 of the money that we need. So that's kind of the key takeaway. That's where the gap is. Now, what I wanted to talk about is a perspective, and that perspective is about using bonds. What you might have heard of green bonds, and green bonds have been around for a long time, but cities can raise bonds. There are not only green bonds, but something called sustainability-linked bonds. And so the green bonds are usually called use-of-proceed bonds. You raise a green bond and you say you're raising the bond, the city is raising a bond to do more solar panels. That's kind of clearly identifying what you're going to do with that money. Whereas sustainability-linked bonds could be just related to a journey, the climate journey of an entity, of a city, and you say, hey, I'm going to reduce my carbon emissions by 30% by 2035, and the market gives you a lower cost of capital and therefore incentivizes you to kind of invest in green technologies. So a lot of these kind of new instruments that are coming up, and cities are also starting to take part into this. What I wanted to show was that this is the kind of size of these markets, where I kind of separated the green bonds, which is the use of proceed bonds, from sustainability-linked bonds. And you can see the green bonds have been around for more than 10 years, and they've been growing quite a bit. And the sustainability-linked bonds are new, and they're just starting to grow. So I just wanted to briefly touch upon, there is a gap. And what I'm saying is that maybe, and there are many ways to raise money for cities, and we can talk about that in the Q&A. But one of the ways, as I've said, is through bonds. And so what are the barriers to raising these bonds? And what I've listed here is just a few. There are a lot more. One of the issues is when you're raising bonds, you have to pay the bonds back. So you need to have revenue generating options. And many times cities lack those revenue generating options. And so what are the kind of solutions for that? Many times cities don't even have access to ways to raise revenue. So that's one of the barriers. The second thing is, if you want to raise a bond, you need to have a bond market. And the problem is, in many cases, U.S. has a very well-developed bond market, and there are a lot of municipal bonds in the U.S., but many countries don't have a developed bond market. So how do you even raise bonds? Then you go to the next one where you say, okay, there's a bond market, but a city, when it goes to raise bond, it doesn't have a good credit profile. And if you don't have a good credit profile, you're not able to raise bonds at a good rate, right? So there are a lot of these barriers that come up. And I'm not going to talk about the solutions. Perhaps we can talk about the solutions in the Q&A. And the final one, as we started to identify, was this lack of capacity in cities to even think about raising bonds. It's a kind of a complicated subject. All right. I just wanted to kind of show this slide. It's kind of hard to read. But what I showed on the previous slide was this kind of generally looking at what are the barriers and solutions. But when you start looking at raising these bonds in a specific context, because typically they're in a specific context, and this was some work that we did in India on solar, municipal solar. How do you raise a municipal solar bond in India? You can see that in the local context, the list of barriers kind of grows exponentially, and you have to find solutions to all these barriers to address these barriers and thereby raise bonds. But the good news is that you can address them and start raising these bonds to embark on the climate journey. So I'll stop here and we'll pick up later. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that, Ganesh. Next up, we have Maya Patnar, who is a Global Director of Cities at CDP. CDP, which was formerly known as the Carbon Disclosure Project, is a global disclosure system for investors, companies, cities, states, regions to manage their environmental impacts. So Maya has kindly joined us today to talk about data systems.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the floor, and good evening, everyone. It's a privilege to join you this evening. Thank you for inviting me to share my view on the role of data in the transition to net zero. Also, it's great to be in an in-person event. It's been a while. I'm attending a lot of remote events these days, so this is really fantastic. And so thank you for introducing me and CDP. CDP probably sounds a bit complicated, so just to explain what we do, which will then help to understand a little bit my arguments around data. So we are a global not-for-profit. We run the world's environmental disclosure system for companies, cities, states, and regions. So in other words, we help organizations track their progress towards the more sustainable future. We're often referred to as kind of the gold standard of environmental reporting. And last year, we were proud to have had 18,000 companies reporting through CDP to their investors and to their purchasing organizations. These companies are worth over 50% of global market capitalization. And they were joined by over 1,000 cities, which is the area that I look after. So all these entities reporting their climate data through CDP's system. In the cities program, we had, like I said, over 1,000 cities from 100 countries across the globe, which represent at least a quarter of the world economy. And we've seen a huge increase in climate data reporting. When we started the cities program in 2011, we had only 48 cities. They're mostly kind of the big mega cities that are part of the C40 network. And again, like I said, this year we had over 1,000. So as we've heard here today, cities are, according to the UN, home to over 55% of the world population and account for 70% of global emissions. They also sit on the front line of the impacts of climate change. Last year, 80% of the cities reporting through us have said that they're already facing significant climate hazards like floods, droughts, or heat waves. So let me answer the question, why are data systems critical for enabling cities to accelerate progress towards net zero emissions? So I'll start by saying that our guiding principle at CDP is what gets measured gets managed. Put simply, if a city doesn't know the nature of its impact on the environment, it can't take effective steps to change it. This applies to reducing emissions, but also to building resilience to the impact of climate change. So the questionnaire that we send out, the questionnaire that cities have to report to, or are asked to report to rather, focus on key metrics on climate change mitigation and adaptation. As climate action looks different for individual cities in different places, the questionnaire takes into account particular characteristics such as population or greenhouse gas emissions per capita. In the questionnaire, there's a focus on emissions data, but not only, also climate governance, city planning, targets, and other key metrics across sectors such as energy, transport, and waste, and also key issues that intersect with climate and climate governance, such as public health, water security, and food. So this questionnaire was designed in consultation with cities themselves and with key partners to really distill key metrics. So this data allows cities to move towards net zero, but it also allows others to help cities and also to keep them accountable to some extent. So we make all the data reported by cities available freely through an open data portal. A growing range of organizations such as the UN, the World Health Organization, the IPCC, and the World Bank, to name a few, use the data to inform policymakers. Our institutional partners like WWF, C40 Cities, and Global Covenant of Mayors, these are organizations that work more closely with cities, use the data to provide more kind of hands-on support to cities. And also to add, a recent report by the UN high-level expert group on net zero commitments concluded that annual reporting is essential to drive accountability and track progress against such commitments. So as we get closer to 2030, which is when the world should be reducing its emission by half, that kind of annual reporting, annual tracking, it becomes increasingly important. The insights from the data are another crucial way of enabling cities to shift the gear on reaching net zero. The insights shed light on best practice, but also on the barriers that need to be overcome to achieve net zero. Let me share just one example. By looking at the data in 2021, we were able to identify the 4 areas where cities were telling us where they need that help from national governments. And they talked about decarbonizing the electricity grid, about helping secure finance for their climate projects, which we heard is a huge gap. Cities were saying that they need national governments to help enable and encourage innovation and the development and scaling of technologies, but also to develop robust policies and regulations that don't change on decarbonizing across different sectors. To say that the data also tracks progress in areas such as science-based targets and investment and finance, to provide greater insight into that finance gap that's facing cities that we talked about. This is really a crucial point and a growing program of work for us, using the data to highlight the needs for finance in cities and encourage investors, private sector investors specifically, to start addressing it. And I also mentioned that we encourage a bit of good old-fashioned healthy competition, who doesn't like that, between cities by publishing the top ranking cities who score an A each year. Last year, 122 cities around the world, with a new wave of cities from the global south, made it into the A-list, driving further action by enabling them to demonstrate their climate leadership credentials and encourage peers to follow. So perhaps to draw our different threads together on the panel, I'll conclude by saying that data systems go one step further than just being the foundation stones of action. They actually underpin and enable change in the other systems that we will discuss today, innovation, governance, and finance, that will enable cities to shift the gear in reaching their net zero goals. Data underpins the need for cities to collaborate with the private sector to deliver the solutions that will help them tackle climate change. It contributes to learning. Data underpins governance, enabling municipal planning and targets to be set and tracked. And data underpins finance, as understanding where finance needs to go can only be solved by data. So hopefully this demonstrates how what gets measured gets managed, and why data is mission critical to city climate action. Please do have a look at our work at CDP, cdp.net, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Maya, and thank you to all of our presenters this evening. A lot of insight around some of the opportunities and the challenges for rethinking our systems towards net zero. So now it's over to you, the audience, if you'd like to ask any questions.
Thank you. Good evening. I'm Liz Leffman and I'm the leader of the County Council. My question is, well, I've got a lot of questions actually because it raises masses of questions, but my question is specifically to Girish. I'm really interested in what you have to say about the sustainability-linked bonds. One of the things as I'm sure you know for councils is the difficulty of raising funding to do what we want to do. We are very ambitious, but actually bridging the gap for local authorities is particularly difficult. And I just wondered if you had any experience of working with local authorities, and have you got any advice for us as to how we might proceed with something like that?
Yeah, that's a loaded question. So on the first part of your question on the sustainability-linked bonds, the way they work is that, let's say you're making a target starting now, let's say your emissions are 100, and then you make a net zero commitment of 0 emissions by 2050. So there's kind of a linear path from 100 now to 0 in 2050. And you commit to that path, and then you raise finance against that path. So the idea is that if, and it's embedded, the market is recognizing that there's an embedding of the reduction in emissions over time. And if you meet your target, then you get a lower rate of interest. So that kind of basically is reducing your interest payments, right? So that's reducing the cost to you as the city, or as the cost to the person raising the bond. So that's the whole idea of the sustainability-linked bonds. And they're becoming more popular now because it's in a way, it's an incentive to be greener. But it's not linked to any specific action, it's linked to your broader reductions. So they're called key performance indicator, or KPI. Now in terms of raising finance for the local bodies, and I think I have not worked directly with the city government on that. When I showed the paper on Indian solar bonds, we did talk to multiple cities, and so a lot of this kind of detailed analysis comes out of that. But I wanted to highlight an initiative that, and I'm not sure that kind of initiative exists here, but there's an initiative that Climate Bonds Initiative, so there's a think tank called Climate Bonds Initiative has come up with a kind of initiative in the US for cities to raise green bonds. So there's a lot of information that's being provided, and I can share that information with you, the actual name of that. And I'm sure a lot of that could be kind of translated to the UK or other countries.
Great, thank you. Any other questions? This gentleman in the back.
Hello, my name is Oliver and I'm a lowly doctoral student here. My question was mostly for Maya, because you spoke about global south cities, and I was particularly interested in what the Carbon Disclosure Project, how you view the differences towards the progress towards net zero of a city like Addis Ababa to a city like Oxford, and the extent to which you bind them by different metrics and different views of progress. Because a net zero Oxford will still be emitting more than I think Addis does today. And so there's this like inherent tension, I think, between cities of the global south's net zero progress towards and Oxford. And I just wondered how you account for that in your carbon disclosure.
Great, thank you so much. So we account for that. So specifically on the city side, on the corporate side, kind of less so on the city side, we're acutely aware of kind of these differences. So the way that we account for it is, first of all, our question, I focused on mitigation because of the title of the panel, but our questionnaire equally focuses on adaptation and mitigation and adaptation and resilience. So for global south cities, we encourage them, even if they're not acting as actively on kind of mitigation or climate action planning, to focus on the resilience and adaptation areas. So that's the first one. And the second one is that we help come up with kind of not the standard, exactly the guidance for setting science-based targets for cities. And there's an inherent kind of part of that which looks at the fair share. So not all cities have to reduce to the same amount. So that is kind of how we look at that. And it was really great to see all those differences that we introduced in our thinking around global south cities making a difference. And this year, like I said, in our global leadership index, really we saw many cities join from the global south. You can find more information on that online. But yeah, I'm happy to chat more about that later in the drinks.
Can I?
Of course.
Yeah. So just to add to this, obviously Oxford may have higher emissions per capita than Addis Ababa. That's fine, but Addis Ababa could also go to zero, starting from wherever they are, right? So that always is true. The other thing that one needs to note is that the South, what we call, is it basically has some of the most polluted cities, right? So if you go to New Delhi or you go to Cairo or you go to Jakarta, I mean, these are extremely polluted cities, and that's all connected to global warming. I mean, part of it is local air pollution, but a lot of it is global air pollution. So even these cities need to clean up. That doesn't go away, right? So wherever you're starting, you got to go to zero. And how you go there, it's up to you, but we are there to help. Yeah.
You just made me realize I forgot something. So one thing that we started doing with cities, such as cities in India, etc., is linking the climate agenda and climate action to global health, to health, exactly. Which is why we have introduced elements in the questionnaire around global health, because it's a lot more palatable. Because when people walk in the street and they can't breathe the air, suddenly the case for climate action, sounds more palatable than when you're just talking about these, global north ideas, net zero and cutting emissions.
Nice.
It's a good question.
Yeah, just on that, I mean, the original program that we developed, which led into the European Cities Mission, was actually called Healthy Clean Cities, and it recognised that actually, if you're talking about the action on the ground, you don't need to be talking about climate, you're talking about thriving places. Yeah, that's at the heart of it. Is it healthy? Is it green? Is it clean? Those are the things that actually, and are there jobs? is there security? These are the things that actually matter. So it is interesting that if you look, and that doesn't matter whether you're in Oxford or in any city anywhere, those are the similar issues come through and the themes come through. So I think that one of the reasons for being here is this link between health and well-being and action on climate change, because there's an inherent link. And in practice, if you look at, you were just picking up the financing point, one of the things that we have been seeing with a lot of cities is, if you're looking at that, and I'm thinking European cities here rather than some of the African cities, but if you're looking at the challenge of financing and you're looking at something like retrofit, it's very, very difficult to finance if you only treat retrofit in isolation, house by house. Can you make the numbers stack up? You can't. Yeah? The only way you can start to do it, we think, and we're testing it in different places in the UK and across Europe, is actually if you link it across at a much more community level, and you look at community well-being, and you look at green spaces, and then you can capture both public goods and private benefit. And then you can bring in pension funds and public money to deliver a particular package into a place, a community, a city, which then delivers both health and well-being benefits as well as private returns on investment for the private investors. So it's those sorts of blended finance things that actually we're seeing, but at the heart of it is health and well-being.
And just connecting to that, you brought up a really good point. How about making cities financiers? Because you are asking the citizens to do all this green stuff, solar panels, green the houses, retrofits. The city raises money through a bond, and the city then becomes a financier to its citizens. So that's many different ways of doing that.
Can I just chip in there as well? Because I think a couple of points. I think for me, the debate about Oxford versus somewhere in the global south is really interesting. Of course, it is why you need to develop those evidence-based local route maps and action plan. I mean, Oxford, even in the UK context, I think we are making good progress on our carbon emission reductions, but of course we don't have an airport, we don't have huge industry. So others would argue, and actually, just got a fixed transport system. But the point being, I think it shouldn't just be seen as a league table. It's about how do you actually really focus on those local challenges. And then on the community engagement, health and well-being piece, I think that's absolutely right. It came through very strongly in our climate, our citizens' assembly, which was a group of people who were absolutely motivated and cared about this, but a lot of other people who were saying, yeah, that's fine, but we've got an even bigger crisis in Oxford around affordable housing, and come back and talk to me about spending money on retrofitting homes when you've actually provided one for all of us. So it's the same thing. So how do you get into the right conversations and get people to buy in a way that actually works for improving what they want to improve? I think aligned to that, the other point I'd make is it's often about finding those community groups and empowering community groups to be working on those local issues that you find ways in. The example that popped into my head is the Eid extravaganza in the city, with the big gathering celebration with the Muslim community. Actually got a real focus on think global, act local, but it's not sort of focused over there as this specific agenda. I think that's what we need to do more.
Great, thank you for that question. I think it actually stimulated a bit of debate between the speakers. Any more questions? Just the lady at the back there.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Louise. I'm a city councillor and I'm the Cabinet Member for Health and Transport. So I know Caroline said it's not a league table, but question one, just is Oxford in the top 100 of the cities going to net zero? But more importantly, I wanted to just give a bit more of a plug for something that Caroline mentioned in her speech, which is this ZCOP, Zero Carbon Oxford Partnership, which is us convening. It's got the universities, it's got the hospitals, it's got BMW, It's got Lucy properties, so it's got all sorts of different strands across the city within it. And I just wondered, how unusual are we in having that? Because I've been peripherally involved in it, and it just is such a powerful way of sharing good ideas, and we might have a logistics hub that we can all share for deliveries and things like that, or share better practice on decarbonising our homes in the private rented sector through Lucy's and through our council houses. So does that seem to be a model that anybody else is doing? And is it a good model? Thanks.
And do you take this
It is a model that other people are doing for precisely what you've said, which is that it's a really powerful way of engaging different players. So I'm involved in one in Edinburgh, which is the universities, the hospitals, the energy company, and a couple of the big employers there, along with the city council, which is about what infrastructure do we need, given that between them they're the ones with the biggest budgets that are spending hundreds of millions on different aspects of infrastructure and so on. So we're seeing a lot of those, and I do think, I think it was a point, Carol, you made as well, that the role of the authorities increasingly, rather than being top down, but that notion of being a fantastic way of convening, and in particular of convening radical partnerships, because we cannot achieve unless we start to bring some of these different groups with very different perspectives together. Don't be put off by saying lots of other people are doing it, because actually everyone's trying it with their own particular place context, and some will be heavy industry and city council, some will be transport hubs. Each one will be different depending on the particular focus of it, but they are absolutely crucial, I think, in our experience across Europe for actually making things happen. So.
Great, thank you. And just leave it up here.
So I'm appalling with names, so I think this is a question for Caroline, but I'm not entirely sure. You were talking about difficulties in kind of working with residents and communities in terms of things like retrofitting housing. Speaking as someone who rents, like I think about 50% of Oxford, who, I was delighted to find out about the sustainable warmth grant that my housemate and I were eligible for. Didn't persuade the landlord in time to actually get it, but also even if we had, some of the things that are available are things like ground source heat pump, air source heat pump, solar panels, insulation, wouldn't cover the cost of actually double glazing the windows. How do you work with residents who don't own their property, who are more likely to be in housing that doesn't have adequate kind of insulation or energy saving measures, especially when often the funding doesn't really seem designed for them?
It's a great question. I mean, the retrofit challenge is huge across the piece. So I will get your answer your question, I promise, but I think hopefully this sort of identifies some of the scale of what we all face here. The City Council's got 8,000 homes in the city. Piece of work recently revealed that it's going to take £500 million for us to get them to net zero. We've just got some funding out of government, which we've match funded, which will allow us to do the first 300. So we're very pleased about that, but just shows the scale of the challenge. You're absolutely right that the sustainable warmth grants and other funding, the take-up is very low, and we get really difficult engaging both with homeowners and with landlords. I think there's a couple of things that we are doing around this. Firstly, again, working with the other authorities in Oxfordshire, is providing a kind of one-stop shop for retrofit, because I think a lot of it, and I know this myself as a homeowner, it's really difficult to know where to start. There are a lot of barriers in the way. And even where there are grants, there's often disruption, the hassle. So convincing landlords and homeowners alike to go for that is really difficult. So finding ways to make it easier, connecting people with grants, trying to reduce the administration, providing services that help people through the process is one element. The other element, I think, is really about what we're trying to trial and test a bit in Rose Hill, is how do you actually work with streets of people and join household, it might be a mix of homeowners, council-owned, private rented sector housing in a street, and come up with a plan that you could actually install measures for a whole street together. Not only does that make it hopefully cheaper and more efficient, but hopefully less disruptive. And I think there's an element of nudge and behaviour change there. So I think they're the things that we've got to look at. We in the city we're the first authority in the country to be granted a borough-wide selective licensing scheme, which gives us the ability to require all landlords in the council, in the city, to have a licence, which unfortunately doesn't give us the power to compel them to go down these measures. But what I think it might do over time is to increase the level of conversation and engagement about the standards of homes and what it means to be a good landlord in the city. So I think they're some of the things that we're going to be driving at.
Great, thanks, Caroline. Any other questions? Just the gentleman at the front here. Thanks.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Ali. I'm doing a PhD basically in citizen participation in community energy projects in cities. Thank you very much for all the knowledge and information. I'm focusing on the social value, and part of it is just transition. So far, it seems like people who are participating in these projects are from specific ethnic background and socioeconomic background as well. It's not as diverse as, for example, the society itself in the UK. How could we work to ensure just transition, specifically in cities? It could be from an innovation point of view, policy point of view, or finance as well. Thanks.
Thank you. Who would like to take that one? Who would like to start? Caroline.
Right, I mean, I think I already touched on this, and I hope I said in my introduction that I do think this is an area that we're not where we need to be yet, and we need to really be focused on it in our next phase. I think some of the barriers are, well, particularly in Oxford, we're a very, very diverse city, not only in terms of, for a city in the southeast, in terms of a third of our population being from ethnic minority backgrounds, but also the number of different groups, so diversity in the sense of where people come from across the world. So there's no such thing as a sort of one approach. And I think what we found that sometimes a kind of assumption that if you engage with the third sector you'll be able to engage with community groups is not really the case, and particularly in this space where a lot of the campaign groups around environment are working with people who are already engaged in the debate. So, I mean, I touched on it before, so I think the answer is in actually tapping into the work that we're doing in the city more generally around working with our communities, using our community impact fund grants, for example, to give community groups small pots of funding to do the things that they want to do in their communities, and often out of them we are actually getting people who in their own communities want to be involved and engaged. And so we're trying to build it from that lens rather than imposing on people a conversation that is difficult to get into. And again, sorry, just before, I think the point to improving quality of life, well-being, and the things which bother people on their daily lives is key to that.
Yeah, if I could just bring a slightly different perspective, which is from some work that was happening a bit north of here, which was when they were trying to roll out renewables, a lot of renewables. One of the issues was to get it through the planning system, you had to get it past local communities. And so there was this whole business of how do you persuade local communities to get involved in saying yes. And so initially there was a sort of sense of, well, as long as you give them a bit of money, you just palm off a bit of money and they'll be fine. And increasingly it became clear that actually, even from a financial perspective of a big company, it was worth actually properly engaging in the communities, perhaps rural communities who are often excluded for various reasons. So not just in pure diversity terms, but actually the sort of rural-urban mix. And that allowed people to start to see other communities being successful and actually using this much more effectively and building their own energy networks and community energy initiatives. And so I suppose the way that this did require some public money, and it required it in a way that was either a grant, and then when the grant, if they then produced an effective community energy solution which generated an income, then that grant turned into a loan, and they had to pay back the loan. So it was a convertible loan, basically, a grant convertible loan. Those sorts of techniques and the peer-to-peer learning between community groups actually started to really mushroom. It really fired interest around a lot of places. So you started to see this sort of growth of community groups that had no interest a couple of years before in anything to do with that, suddenly realising that they had social capital, that they had something that they could bring together, and that there were tools and mechanisms by which they could generate something beneficial for them, which actually supported what they were doing. So it wasn't because of climate change, it was that they could see something that benefited their community. And so we can see patterns and pathways that work in different places. Whether that works here, I think, depends very much on a particular context, that public-private, the diversity and so on. But there are routes that you can show how you can get to a point where you do start to have a proper just transition, which is bringing in some of these excluded communities.
I'll just add quickly to that. So I think one of the problems in information, because people who are better informed, they get access to everything. So how do you do this grassroots campaigning, right? But that's not my area, but that's one thing that's an issue. The other one is just access to finance, right? And there are many ways you can improve that. And I will take the example of another kind of group, the small and medium enterprises, right? So they don't have access to finance. And that's connected to even many communities. They don't have access to finance because they don't have good credit profile, something called a credit profile. So there are ways to improve these credit profiles or provide access to finance even with weaker credit profiles. So there are examples of that we can use for specific purposes. Yes.
So I'm just conscious of time, so maybe just a wee quick point and then to wrap up and grade.
Okay, really quick, it's just such a good question. So just in terms of what the data is showing, in terms of what cities are doing on the just transition, so it's clear why kind of a just transition is needed, so I'm not going to focus on that, but cities are already impacted by climate change in the UK and outside the UK. They're saying that, vulnerable population, specifically low-income households, are most impacted often, so it makes it really critical to think about the just transition. And in a report that we published last year, Protecting People and Planet, it's on the website, we found that cities that include their people, their communities in their climate action planning, and we looked at several criteria there, tend to be better at identifying kind of co-benefits from climate action, and also tend to kind of take more climate actions that benefit people. So there's a whole report about it, but yeah, very, very good question.
Great, thanks for that, and a big thank you to all of our speakers this evening.